Economic theory tells us that the more a worker produces, the higher the salary he will receive. This in theory makes a lot of sense. If every time you produce things that have more and more value, naturally your employer will be able and will have an incentive to give you a higher salary. Under this assumption, if we want to improve people's quality of life, we must increase their productivity. So naturally they will generate more and more income, with which they could buy more goods and services. Policies in favor of the minimum wage, increasing the strength of the unions, and so on, will not be necessary in this case. We will only need to focus on making people more and more productive. Therefore, state intervention will not be necessary. At least, all this is what the classic economic theory tells us, but this is not what a study by the Economic Policy Institute, EPI, argues. The graph provided by this institution shows that although it's true for the United States that the relationship between remuneration and productivity was true between 1948 and 1979, from 1980 to 2014 there has been a great divergence. In this last period, productivity grew by 72.2%, while workers' compensations only increased by 9.2%. These numbers seem to indicate that the growth in productivity was 7.84 times the growth in payment, this being perfectly observed in the gap that we can see in the graph. This apparent divergence has neither been ignored nor forgotten by little USA's politicians. Former President Barack Obama said, since 1979, when I graduated from high school, our productivity has increased by more than 90%, but the income of the typical family has increased by less than 8%. Former presidential candidate and current Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren mentioned that if the minimum wage had kept pace with productivity, the minimum wage would be $22 an hour. More recently, Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar posted this tweet where she implied that the reason why corporations and bosses cannot find workers is a consequence of the great disparity between what each worker produces and what they are being paid. In addition, a few weeks ago, on the International Labor Day, Robert Reich, Secretary of Labor during the Bill Clinton administration, posted this tweet mentioning this divergence between productivity and compensation, attributing it to the decline in union participation in the economy. The implications of this study are enormous. If it is correct, then the neoclassical economic theory of salary remunerations is wrong. In other words, increasing productivity will not necessarily increase people's quality of life. Consequently, public policy should not be focused on the growth and efficiency of the economy, but rather on distribution. More taxes on the rich and increasing the minimum wage, greater and stricter labor regulations, and other distribution policies will be the key to prosperity. In fact, this is what the Institute of Economic Policy, the institution that carried out the study, proposes. Is this research institute right? Is the President Barack Obama correct? Have the increases in productivity in this country been monopolized by the capitalist class that extracts income from the rest of the population? Well, in reality, this is not the case. The results of this study are completely wrong, and in a few moments we will show why this is so. Before dismantling the methodological errors of this study, we must start with something fundamental to understand the problem. We must begin by describing what productivity is. I have been repeating this word for a long time, but I have not yet described it, and it would be completely wrong to want to dismantle the supposed gap between wages and productivity without first having fully defined its most important component, which is productivity. When we talk about labor productivity, we refer to the relationship between the inputs used for a process and the result of the process itself. For example, suppose two blacksmiths are in charge of making identical swords. One blacksmith is called Brian and the other one is called Ernesto. Brian is a very skilled blacksmith who uses the forge better, while Ernesto is not as good as Brian. Therefore, Brian produces 4 times as many swords as Ernesto produces in the same amount of time. That is to say that in one day, Brian is capable of producing more swords than Ernesto. As a consequence, we say that Brian is more productive than Ernesto. In economics, we define productivity in the same way. The more you can produce in the same amount of time and with the same inputs, the more productive you are. In theoretical terms, we define labor productivity as the value of goods and services produced divided by the hours worked. While we produce more valuable things using fewer hours, we become more productive. In a few words, productivity is a measure of how efficient we are in the use of goods and labor to produce goods and services. The more efficient we are, the more productive, and therefore we need less to produce more. The less efficient we are, the less productive, and as a consequence we need more to produce less. In neoclassical economic theory, the salary is equal to the marginal productivity of workers, meaning that employers will pay the worker an incremental remuneration until that amount is equal to the additional cost that it costs to produce another unit of the good or service. In this case, the employer does not pay the employee more because a loss will be incurred, and this is something that is not convenient for him. On the opposite case, why doesn't the employer pay less than the marginal productivity to the employee? Well, because if a person can produce more than what they are being paid, they will have no reason to stay in that place, and could work on their own or find another job where they are paid for what they can produce. Because of this, if the economic theory is true, increasing productivity is a necessary condition to increase people's income. Knowing this, we can now study the relationship between productivity and wages. It is time to see if they really have any relationship, or in the USA case, if there is a huge gap that is appropriated by the capitalist. One of the most recent studies on this subject is Productivity and Payment, Is the Relationship Broken?, published by Harvard University and written by Anna Stransbury and Laura Sommer. Here it was found that the relationship between these two variables is not broken. In fact, they found evidence that between 1973 and 2016, 1 more percentage point of productivity growth has been associated with 0.7 to 1 percentage point more median and average compensation growth, and 0.4 to 0.7 more percentage points of compensation growth for production workers and non-supervisors. In short, this study shows that on average, an increase in productivity is related to a salary increases of between 70 and 100%. This seems to indicate that increasing productivity is still substantially important for the income families in the United States of America. In addition to the above, labor economist Jamie Sherk obtained the following graph from his research. Here we can see that the average growth in productivity and compensation for non-farm workers is almost on par. Since 1973, the productivity per hour increased by 81%, while the average compensation of workers increased by 78%. Furthermore, this relationship still holds for sectoral measures, since the industries that have increased their productivity the most have also increased their wages the most. James Sherk himself tells us that the average hourly productivity increased by 150% in the oil and gas extraction sector between 1987 and 2013. During that period, average hourly compensation in that sector increased by 126%. Similarly, productivity at department stores grew only 16% during those years. In that period, the average real compensation of grocery store employees grew by 19%. All this seems to indicate that the gap between productivity and wages in the United States of America is non-existent. To these studies, we could also add other studies that arrive to the same conclusion, such as Dean Baker, director of the Center for Economic and Political Research, Harvard professor Robert Lawrence, who served on President Bill Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors, or even Professor Stephen Rose of George Washington University. All these studies came to the same conclusion: the apparent gap between salary and productivity becomes non-existent under real scrutiny. But then, we need to ask us, why does the study by the Economic Policy Institute indicate the existing gap? Why did President Obama, Senator Warren, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, and Robert Reich cite this study when there was no support for it? Well, now it's time to dismantle the study and thus understand why it is wrong. To dismantle the study, we will return to the work of James Sherk one last time. Although it's true that I have read several studies that seek to dismantle the myth of the gap between productivity and salary, I consider that Sherk's work is the one that does it the best. As a consequence, I will use it as a reference to demonstrate errors of the Economic Policy Institute study. With that said, we will show that this gap does not exist for reasons like corporate greed or further exploitation of workers by the capitalist class. Rather, it simply exists because the study that so many people cite is in fact wrong. That is, it has serious methodological errors, being specifically the following 3 errors. First, when this study analyzes the salary evolution of workers in this country, it doesn't consider the salary increases of approximately the 37% of the working population, meaning it does not take into account all the compensation that the workers receive. This error represents 44.8% of the existing gap. Second, it uses wrong price deflators to measure the evolution of productivity and wages. Finally, and third, 12.3% of the gap is explained by the fact that it includes the productivity of self-employed workers but does not include their salary. Now, let's look at each of these points individually. Let's start with the problem of salary evolution. In the study where it's concluded that there is a huge gap between productivity and remuneration, the entire US working population was not considered when talking about salary evolution. The survey they use only includes 63% of the workers in the country, these being production workers and those who are in position when they are not in charge of supervising other workers. The problem is that this survey does not measure the salary evolution of all those workers who are self-employed, of those workers who are government employees, and of 20% of the workers of private companies. The survey leaves out 37% of workers in the country's economy. In addition to this survey also leaves out most performance-based compensation, such as commissions, bonus, and stocks. Sherk mentioned that these types of remuneration have become especially popular since the 1970s. For example, Steve Jobs only received an annual salary of $1, but he became a multi-billionaire because Apple paid him with company shares. Under the study methodology, this type of payment to Steve Jobs or any other person who received this type of compensation wouldn't be reflected. Once we correct these 2 errors, that is, when we add 37% of the country's workers and the missing compensation to the study, wage growth between 1973 and 2014 increases from a mere 10% to 47%. Therefore, the gap that was originally presented to us decreases by 44.8%. There will be people who will argue that the exclusion of so many people and this type of remuneration was the right thing to do, because the people excluded might correspond to the relatively poor population of the country. But the reality is that if you want to do a study that measures how companies compensate workers based on increases in productivity, it is necessary to capture all workers, leaving out 37% of workers in the United States, that is almost 4 out of 10 working people, with the argument that they are the richest, does not make any sense. I reiterate, leaving out almost 40% of the population in a study that seeks to analyze the salary increases for workers with the argument that this 40% is the least poor does not make any sense. That being said, let's move on to the second error of the study, which is using different deflators to measure salary and productivity inflation. But before that, I would like to make a parenthesis to be able to understand what a deflator is. As many of you know, today's money is not worth the same as money from 50 years ago. That is to say, $10 in 2023 does not buy the same as $10 in 1970. While today, with that money, you can buy toilet paper, a few eggs, and little else. Previously, with that money, you could comfortably make a large part of all the super. For this reason, when we compare current amounts of money with past amounts of money, we must adjust them to make them comparable. That is, we want to convert the $10 of 1970 into dollars of 2023 to see what we could buy with that money. The deflators are adjustment measures that allow us to transfer that past money into present money. The problem with the study is that when it calculates the increases in productivity and the increase in remuneration, it uses two different deflators. While to measure workers' compensation, they use the Consumer Price Index or CPI, to measure productivity inflation, they use the implicit price deflator. This creates an artificial gap between productivity and its compensation. Because we are not talking about the same thing, this will be like comparing gum to apples. In addition to this, it does not make any sense to talk about using the CPI for the worker's remuneration, because as we discussed before, the worker's salary is based on what he produces and not on what he consumes. Therefore, using this index does not make any sense. Regarding this, there are other very important clarifications, but there are very much technical issues that will be cumbersome to include in this video. So I will simply leave the study in the description, and whoever is interested in reading the technical details will be able to read it. But what we must understand is that this misuse of deflators narrows the gap by 38.9%, so when we add the previous percentage, we already have explained 83.7% of the difference. Now let's move to the last point. Finally, we must talk about the last methodological error of the study, this being not including the remuneration of self-employed workers, but including their increases in productivity. Not all the people that exist in this country are owners of a company or work for an employer in a direct way. There are many plumbers who bought their tools and work for themselves, or truckers who bought their truck and choose their routes. There are also people who work at Uber, Didi, and related business, or there are also people who own a business who put many hours into it, such as restaurants or a corner store. All these people count as self-employed employees, who are very important to the economy of this country. In fact, as we can see in these graphs, their participation in the economy has been increasing steadily. On the left side, we can see how the share of self-employed workers in net GDP has been constantly increasing. On the right side, we can see how this group of workers has reached almost 11% of total workers by 2014. The problem is that the study does not take into account the salary increases of these people. When we include this, the gap between productivity and wages closed by 12.3% more. That is, when we took all factors into account, we finally managed to close the gap by 96%, reaching the initial graph that shows that there is a relationship between productivity and salary. Having adjusted all this, we can see how the famous gap between wages and productivity used to justify dozens of public policies by dozens of politicians has no theoretical support, but it is above all an artificial construct. Having said this, it doesn't mean that everything is perfect. It doesn't mean that the USA economy is completely free of a large number of problems, because although it's true that the compensation for work has gone hand in hand with respect to increases in productivity, it is also very true that these increases have not been equally distributed through the society of this country. When we divide the working population into quintiles by income, that is, divide them into 5 equal parts based on their income, the 5th quintile being the poorest and the 1st quintile the richest, we realize that while in the period from 1979 to 2014, the 1st quintile, that is the richest 20%, increased their average compensation by 69%, and in the last quintile, that is the poorest 20%, this compensation grew in 58%. In the middle quintiles, average compensation only grew by 20, 18, and 32% respectively. That is to say that while the poorest people and the richest people saw their income increase rapidly, the middle class increased their income in a comparatively slower manner. This because of factors such as technological change and globalization. Knowing this and knowing that compensation is closely linked to productivity, it is necessary to understand what policies could have increased the productivity of the middle class so that it can become more prosperous. Another important clarification as the relationship between salary and productivity only occurs when there is a competitive market. For example, suppose there is only one company in the whole country and no one else can work except for this company. In this case, the company can impose the wages it pays to workers no matter how productive the worker is. Because the worker has nowhere to go, even if the company pays him below marginal productivity, the employee will stay there because he has no other option. Therefore, if in any case we find that despite the fact that the productivity rises, wages do not, it is possible a case where there is a non-competitive industry, and as a consequence the ideal will be to promote competition in that sector. Although it's true that this case is not that of the United States, nor is it a case that is seen daily, I think it's important to take into consideration. To summarize all this, we can say that the gap between salary and productivity in the United States of America is a myth based on a study with several methodological errors. Until today, there seems to be no better way to increase income in a constant way for workers of this country other than increasing its productivity. The path to prosperity for workers in the United States and around the world lies in making them more productive, in making them capable of producing more goods and services in less time and with fewer resources. Therefore, ways must be found so that the middle class of this country can become more productive. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video. I'm Rodolfo Herrera, and I say goodbye.